Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is, like almost everyone else, the United States presidential election. America has a long history, obviously, of presidential elections, and the American Jewish community has a very strong and important role to play in those elections. The American Jewish community made a serious mistake in 2008 in the presidential election. Barack Obama won that election, and the outcome took American Jewry by surprise, although the polls were very clear that he was going to win. But the American Jewry actually believed that McCain would win. Both Jewish leadership in the United States and Israeli leadership assumed the Republicans under Senator John McCain, an American war hero, would win and win easily. They invested little energy in cultivating Obama and his campaign, and we are still paying the price for that very serious mistake to this day. Mainstream American Jewry was boxed out of the White House during the Obama administration. J Street became the go-to address. It was a serious strategic error. The relationship between the White House and Israel cooled significantly. It was no longer the warm relationship fostered under the previous tenant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, George Bush 43, or Bush Haben, as the Israelis like to call him. And Israel suffered not only in terms of ties with the United States, Israel suffered at the UN and suffered in the international communities. Countries saw that the United States was no longer unconditionally supporting Israel and felt freer to pursue their own anti-Israel agenda without fear of reprisal. And now the United States gears up for an election to take place in November. The Republican nominee, Donald J. Trump, is a known commodity. He's also known throughout the world as a good friend of Israel. In the eyes of some Jews and Israelis, the best U.S. presidential friend Israel has ever had. The U.S. Democratic nominee is not just a former Vice President, Joe Biden. He was Obama's vice president. That's an important distinction. And his chosen running mate, Senator Kamala Harris, may be married to a Jew, but their stance on Israel is relatively unknown and still unproven. The Israeli press has spent a lot of time dealing with, as by the way, the American Jewish press has also, spent a lot of time, a lot of print hours, and airtime analyzing whether Harris is good for the Jews or bad for the Jews, good for Israel or bad for Israel, and speculating about her presence will strengthen the Democratic position on Israel or not. My grandmother used to ask me this question a little differently every time there was an election. In her words, my bubby's words, will it be good for the Yidden? She would ask. Will he be or they be friends in the White House? I still hear that question today, albeit unaccented, coming from many sources. It is an important question. My answer is that he or she, or they, will be as good a friend for Jews, as good a friend for Israel, as we are friends to them. The issue of support for Israel must be approached as a bipartisan topic. It cannot be the purview of one party or the other party. It's too important. Jewish and Israeli representatives, lovers of Israel, and donors need to make inroads into the Biden-Harris ticket, just as they have and should continue to do for the Trump-Pence ticket. There needs to be a strong pro-Israel relationship emanating from Washington and a strong relationship with Jewish leadership, no matter who occupies the White House. This is an essential issue. There is a perception that the Democratic Party has been taken over by the squad, by a group of progressive congresswomen pushing a very progressive agenda, which includes questioning the once unquestionable support for Israel. They mimic Bernie Sanders, who clearly articulated that aid to Israel should be used as an incentive to leverage and to achieve U.S. progressive agendas in Israel. And primary elections are warning us that the squad is here to stay. But despite their media spotlight and despite the high decibel level of mainstream media coverage of them, it seems clear that the squad does not represent the rank and file of the Democratic Party. That should be very clear. Anyone, and you should know this, at this point, the presidential election is far too open, far too far away to call. Anyone who predicts the result of this election is merely offering up hope for the election, not their knowledge or analysis. There is no polling accurate enough to know what the end result will be at this stage. Weeks ahead of time, it's impossible because this amount of time is a lifetime in politics and in electioneering. You can only really start telling these things towards the end of October. We Jews and lovers of Israel must show our support for both candidates and for both parties. Not one, both. And politicians know that. They won't hold it against us. The bona fides of Biden and Harris on Israel are not what matter. What matters is the proven record, or neither, by the way, does it matter about Trump and Pence and their record, positive or not, no matter where you are. Think about who will be better for Israel and who will be a better friend of the Jews, and all the other considerations in choosing a candidate. Then vote for the person on the election day, on Tuesday, November 3rd. But make your political contributions to both campaigns and let each campaign know that you have contributed. What matters is that the Jewish community and lovers of Israel will be standing alongside the person sworn in as President of the United States on January 20th, 2021. Standing alongside as welcome and invited guests, as advisors and consultants, and sounding boards, as valued and trusted constituents, no matter who the president is. The error that was made in 2008 cannot be repeated in 2020, cannot ever be repeated. The stakes are far too high and the risks far too great. I've also been thinking about the relationship between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It's called the Abraham Accord. By the way, it's singular, Abraham Accord. It is an agreement, a peace deal between, once upon a time, not very long ago, sworn enemies, Israel and the United Arab Emirates. It is a gargantuan game changer for the Middle East. The UAE is not the first Arab country to forge a peace agreement with Israel. The first deal was signed between Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat on March 26, 1979. At that time, Jimmy Carter was President of the United States. Years later, on July 25, 1994, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan met in the desert location and signed that treaty. By the way, I was present in that desert signing. U.S. President Bill Clinton was there beside the two Middle East leaders, and I was not more than 20 feet away. Today's headlines are being made by Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan of the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is a federation of 7 emirates, each with a sovereign leader, and together they select a president. They are the third Arab country, only the third Arab country, to see the wisdom in signing a peace treaty with Israel, a treaty that was brokered by the U.S. President Donald Trump and by his administration and his advisors. The biblical reference in this agreement cannot be overlooked. It is, of course, named after the progenitor of both Muslims in the Quran and Jews in the Bible. In English, Abraham. In Arabic, Ibrahim. In Hebrew, obviously, Avraham. And it is a watershed for the region. The United Arab Emirates, the UAE, has taken a bold step. It is also carefully thought through the strategically planned step. Other Arab countries will, in all probability, soon follow in their footsteps, and very quickly, actually, we're going to see more and more of them. All of them, maybe not all of them, but almost all of them. Countries like the United Arab Emirates look at the region and at the world through practical diplomatic lenses now, and not through the lenses of Islamic national ideology. It is an erosion of the ideology that merged with Pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism is a philosophy that emerged out of Egypt's President Nasser and Syria's President Assad, that tried to link all Arabs through the Ba'athist Islamist ideology. And it is reasonable to assume that Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, will be next in line. These 3 Arab countries often coordinate their foreign policies platforms in general. Forward-thinking and pushy presidencies aside, one of the most important driving forces in the creation of the Abraham Accord is not what one would expect. It is rather the desire by Israel and the United Arab Emirates to unite against Iran. It was their driving need to unite against an extremely dangerous common enemy. The Abraham Accord is a clear realization of Machiavelli's principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sunni Gulf states and many other Arab states see Iran as a destabilizing force in the region. There is clear and obvious tension between Shiites of Iran and the vast majority of the Arab world, which is Sunni. Causing Iran pain is a painless way for these states, as it is for the United States and Israel, to get a win. Peace with Israel is also a practical thing to do. The UAE and other future Arab states will create peace treaties with the Jewish state, very much want Israeli technology. They know that they need Israeli technology. Israeli tech and know-how will catapult these Arab countries into a new technological and technical era. The idea is very valuable. This deal has been in the works for 3.5 years. US President Donald Trump made it a priority. His son-in-law Jared Kushner and trusted others worked tirelessly to make the accords happen. They kept their progress secret. Even Netanyahu kept his frenemies, his friend enemies in his new coalition, out of the loop for fear of leaks that would torpedo the agreement. Chaim Saban, the creator of the wildly successful Transformers, was deeply involved in nudging the sides together. Saban is an Israeli American. He made his name not just with the Transformers itself, but in Hollywood itself. He's a longtime Democratic supporter. For the good of the Middle East, Saban crossed the aisle and worked together with the Trump White House for the good of the entire Middle East, not just for Israel and for the United Arab Emirates, but really for the world. Saban is a hero here. It should also be obvious that the traditional narrative of the Palestinian cause was the centerpiece of all issues in the Middle East, has now officially crumbled. For decades, it was assumed that no progress could happen in the Middle East until the Palestinian issue was resolved. That no longer is the case. And yet, the Abraham Accord is predicated on tabling Israel's plan to annex part of the West Bank, a plan that was and has for months been the cause of great consternation of the Palestinian Authority. And what was the Palestinian response to the announcement of the accord, the Abraham Accord, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates? The Palestinians called it treason. The UAE went out of their way to announce that the agreement will advance the Palestinian cause, that it puts, quote, gravitas of the UAE, unquote, behind the Palestinian cause. They explained that because of the agreement, Israel's annexation has been tabled. Specifically, they said that the agreement, quote, dealt a death blow to the annexation plans, unquote. And then Hamas echoed the PA response, saying that the accords are, quote, stabbing our people in the back, unquote. Iran, too, is, of course, greatly displeased with the agreement. The settler community in Israel had high hopes of annexation of parts of the West Bank. They're disappointed, too, by the accords and the tabling of the annexation. Most settlers realized that the momentum had already slowed and that the actual chances of annexation had been reduced already because President Trump had placed pressure on Netanyahu. They thought that it was because President Trump had asked for a timeout until the November election, but they realize now the importance of each peace treaty Israel signs. The Abraham Accord is a huge foreign policy success for Trump. More importantly, it is proof that the anti-Iran movement within the Arab world is strong. It even outweighs loyalty to the Palestinian cause, and it is a sign that Israel's success is contagious. The world is changing. Israel and the United States are on the cutting edge, and any country anywhere in the world that hitches a ride with Israel or the United States will advance their national agenda. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is an editorial from Ynet, written by Uri Heitner, published on August 22nd, and it's entitled, Israel Must Keep Out of Inter-Arab Conflicts. Heitner, by the way, has written regularly for Yediot, Ynet, and we've used him 3 times. This is our 3rd time that we're using him. Heitner correctly explains that Israel must stay out of internal Arab issues and conflicts. Israel must defend itself, but offer only aid and humanitarian assistance to Arab countries. Heitner begins. Almost 2 weeks ago, the attention of the Israeli media and the public shifted. Instead of the coronavirus pandemic and its economic and political fallout, the headlines were all about the devastating explosion in the port of Beirut that destroyed nearly half the city, not least because it happened just next door. Ordinarily, such a dramatic event would have been immediately followed by blame being directed at Israel. But in this case, both the Lebanese state and the Hezbollah terrorist organization refrained from pointing the finger at Jerusalem. Heitner is 100% correct, especially because, naturally, the Arab world would have blamed Israel. But this explosion was so large that even that kind of crazy theory would not and could not fly. Heitner continues, blaming Israel would have necessitated a response from Hezbollah that could have ultimately led to war, dealing the already struggling country a death blow, which would have been attributed to the Iranian-backed organization. Unfortunately, while Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah opted not to promote the conspiracy theory in Israel, there were those who were not as responsible. Far-right former MK Moshe Feiglin, for example, was quick to celebrate the death of civilians, branding them enemies, and others slammed Tel Aviv Mayor Ron Huldai for displaying the Lebanese flag in lights on City Hall as a gesture of support for the victims. Any event in the region has ramifications in Israel. In 2010, a bureaucrat abused a street vendor to set himself on fire in protest, and the Arab Spring began. It brought down Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak and was replaced by the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi, before being toppled in turn by Abdallah Fattah el-Sisi. It launched a popular uprising in Syria and turned into a bloody civil war, paving the way for Iranian entrenchment on Israel's borders. It saw the rise and fall of ISIS and brought Russian hegemony back to the Middle East and opened the door to an alliance between Israel and Sunni nations in the Gulf. Israel has acted responsibly during this past turbulent decade and should continue to do so. Now, Heitner comes to his conclusion, and this is important. It shows just how valuable this idea is. He writes, it should maintain, Israel that is, it should maintain neutrality in any inter-Arab conflict, act effectively and resolutely against any threat to its security, and offer humanitarian assistance to the Lebanese people as it did during the Syrian civil war when it cared for the wounded civilians and soldiers alike in its field hospital on the border. Heitner's piece is short and clear, and he is correct on every level. Interestingly, the piece doesn't have a real conclusion. It simply ends having stated his case. That's not a very good column, because conclusions are important in columns. Sometimes that's okay, and in this case, it doesn't hurt his argument not to have a conclusion. Next up is a column by David Suisa, and it's from the Jewish Journal from LA. Suisa writes a weekly column in the journal, and he also happens to be the president and CEO of the journal. It is important to note that he was born in Casablanca, and he's writing actually about the UAE and the Israel peace deal and liberal Zionists. So it's a very interesting piece, I think, and very probing. This column was published on August 16th and is entitled, After UAE Deal, Will Liberal Zionists Stand on the Right Side of History? It's subtitled, The Forces of Darkness in the Middle East Are Panicking. One of the most powerful Arab countries in the world has made peace with the dreaded Zionist enemy. Suisa asks a series of questions that literally probe the very essence of what's going on in the Jewish community. And this peace deal is essential in that probe. Suisa asks about the seismic change and asks whether good-hearted but mistaken Jews will see it as it is or side with those who are lambasting the accord, the Palestinians, Turkey, and Iran. This is how Suisa begins. For these forces of darkness, anything that challenges the demonization of the Jewish state is a disaster. In order for these regimes to survive, Israel must remain the irredeemable sinner, the evil oppressor of Palestinians, the Jewish invader who took over holy Muslim land. This dark view of Israel has long been the mother's milk sustaining the dictators of the region, keeping attention away from their own corruption, incompetence, and oppression of their people. The Problem is that in the long run, any model based on lies and manufactured hatred is not sustainable. At some point, people wake up. People have to eat and make a living. People have to envision a better future. This opens them up to truths. Suisa is so correct on this. This, by the way, he borrows from Sharansky in his thesis of democracy and totalitarianism. So Suisa then gives a series of examples proving his point and then comes to his conclusion. He talks about truths, new truths, and hard questions for the Arab world and for liberal Jews. He writes, new truths and hard questions may be dawning in the Arab world, such as, have Palestinian leaders failed their people? Have Arabs been lied to all these years about Israel? Is it true the Jews have a deep and biblical connection to the land and to Jerusalem? Can Arab nations indeed partner with Israel for a better future? This new moment is a big test for liberal Zionists. If they allow their opposition to President Donald Trump to mute their support for a new direction that can transform the Middle East, they will fail both the Zionist and Arab causes. But if they tell Palestinian leaders the truth, that they no longer have veto power over progress in the region, and it's time to negotiate in good faith, and if they encourage the other Arab states to follow the United Arab Emirates, lead and make a seminal peace deal with Israel, well, they would endorse a major accomplishment of the Trump administration right before an election. Like I said, quite a test. Suisa writes a very compelling piece that poses very serious challenges to the majority of today's liberal Judaism and their thinking. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 3 cartoons today. All deal with the modern issues facing us today and the new reality, especially in the midst of COVID and after COVID. The first is a play on the idea of memes, which are online images. The caption here reads, "This is how we stole memes in the day." It portrays a person using silly putty. Remember silly putty? It came in a red egg-shaped plastic. We would press it against the newspaper and reproduce the image of the newspaper. And anyone who has ever done laundry knows that it will never come out of your clothes. That is silly putty. The meme is of Calvin and Hobbes comic strip. By the way, this system also worked with Play-Doh. Second up is a portrayal of 2 young boys walking outside their elementary school. They were wearing masks, and one says to the other, "Remember when the scariest thing you could get at school was your report card?" This is a hilarious and insightful take on what children must be feeling when they go or do not go to school. This last cartoon follows the same theme, but pokes fun at COVID testing and the ritual involved. A teacher is in the classroom, the teacher is masked, as are the students. On the board are simple math equations. The famous alphabet chart in block and cursive letters is on top of the board. On the desk are an apple, a box of Kleenex, and disinfectant spray. The teacher says, "Test time. Put away your books, take out your number 2 swabs, and stick them up your noses." In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Turkish President Erdogan hosted a full delegation of Hamas. That's unnerving, but not surprising. Turkey supports Hamas financially and politically, and Turkey even granted citizenship to many Hamas leaders. Present at the meeting were Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, as well as Hamas military wing founder Salah al-Aruri, who is wanted by the U.S. government as a terrorist. Also there were the head of Hamas's foreign branch, Maher Salah, and the government's representative in Turkey, Jihad Yagmor. Now, the group went to Turkey to report on the Palestinian situation. 2 topics were discussed, certainly: Israel's planned annexation of the West Bank and the UAE peace accord. Interestingly, the Palestinians are still burning about the Israel's annexation of West Bank areas, despite the fact that it was shelved in the peace accord. Well, whatever. Turkey, together with Iran, Hamas, and the PA, are among very few voices to have publicly condemned the UAE-Israel agreement. Turkey has become a sponsor of terror, They have moved into a position parallel to Iran in joining forces with those who oppose the West, especially the United States and Israel. I read a fascinating article the other day why the United States destroyed their entire fleet of F-14 Tomcats in 2007. The entire fleet was destroyed. It was retired. But not just retired, destroyed. Each fighter jet could have been sold for parts or whole for $38 million each, but they destroyed them all. The reason was President Bush opted to destroy the fleet instead of selling it off because when the F-15 Tomcat was in its heyday, the Shah of Iran bought 80 of them. After the fall of the Shah, those planes fell into the hands of the Ayatollah. Iran's new Air Force had planes after the Islamic Revolution, and they have them still to this day. Bush was thinking of the future. He knew that one day those planes would need parts. That day has come. Iran's Air Force needs spare parts, and because of the decision made all the way back in 2007, the Iranian Air Force has been seriously weakened. For some, irony is so tragic. It's also hilariously funny. And so tensions are heating up between Israel and Gaza. Hundreds of balloons and kite bombs launched from Gaza have caused fires and caused terrible and costly damage in Israel. Israel has responded by striking at those terror bases, the place from which the kites and the balloon bombs are launched. But there were three, actually it's escalating each night and it's getting worse and worse. 3 rockets hoping to strike fear into Israel's borders actually were launched from Gaza and fell inside Gaza. The rockets never made it out of Gaza, not because they were shot down or intercepted, but because they dropped from the sky onto Gaza itself. Hamas was trying to send a message to Israel that these rockets could hit the very center, the heartland, central Israel. Instead, they demonstrated just how inept they were. Ironic, but funny. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Did you know that the word mask actually derives from the Hebrew word masecha? You get it? Masecha, mask, masecha. Today, and in the foreseeable future, we all wear masks. All forms of masks. They will be part of our lives for a long time, and certainly a part of our memory. It's important to know the derivation of important words, especially words that involve such critical dimensions of our lives. Masecha has the same roots in Arabic and in Aramaic. It then makes its way into Latin and then into French, where the word masquerade emerges. Most dictionaries leave out the Hebrew and Arabic derivation and begin only with the Latin. Some actually skip that also and start with the French. The gall of them. That was a pun, because the ancient region of France was known as Gaul. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.